Jessica Pettit, and we are here today with what is going to be known as the last chapter, which is called Onward. And the author is actually one of the original authors of the 1979 project who has come back and actually states that it's called Onward because of their future views and future work that lays ahead. And so I am here today with my friend Stacy, and we're going to talk about what was written in this chapter, but also kind of for you, let's go onward too. We have work that we need to do as well. So I'm super honored to be joined with Stacy so that we can kind of talk about I've been calling my brain Stroganoff brain after reading the whole book. Stacy, like most of you, has not read the rest of the book and has only read the concluding chapter, to my knowledge. And it's infuriating enough to probably be a pretty hot conversation today. But what I want us to really be able to do is to understand what I think is one of the most important pieces as a self-described pinko commie liberal, is that for a lot of us, I think we've just realized that we are an organized minority. And if we become less organized onward, that's on us. And so what can we do to stay organized and move forward together? I think that's one of the biggest lessons I've taken from reading this whole Project 2025. So, Stacy, let me turn it over to you. What are some of your thoughts to get us started? What are some of the big lessons that you got, even just from the final notes of the document? How are you doing after just reading that?
So full transparency, I did go and read some bits of the rest of it just for context, but I did try and
they'll get
yes, I did try and focus on the afterward. The first thing I looked up was Onward because he says in the document that that is a phrase he uses, and normal other books would call this the afterword. So do we think that it's coincidental that that's just his favorite word, or is it really a reference to Onward Christian Soldiers? Is my first question for you, because it seems like it would sort of kind of have to be.
Onward Christian Shoulders definitely has been referenced, not in the text, but in stuff written about it. So I don't think you're wrong on the observation. It's also 922 pages long, and 922 is the reference of like when everything begins again. So I think that is also relevant. Whether it is a fun fact or it is a conspiracy theory, we're really in the right font, aren't we, with the whole document? So, yeah. So I'll start with one of the things that has actually provided a sense of hope for me. I don't know that I was prepared to get hope out of this project, but especially with President Carter's recent passing. The first project was written during Carter's presidency and came out in 1979 because Carter was such a progressive president and ahead of his time. He was talking about electric vehicles. He put solar panels on the White House. And I think it is safe to say that during Carter's presidency, he may possibly have been one of the first presidents in, I'm going to say, modern times. How are you defining modern times? I'm going to say color television as the demarcation. But one of the first presidents that was loathed and hated, and really that loathing led to what is the beginnings of the conservative right. How that connects into evangelical Christians and stuff is yet to be kind of determined. Interestingly, Carter identified as an evangelical Christian, but the first Heritage Foundation project, 1979, was to set Ronald Reagan up for great success. Ronald Reagan implemented about 50% of the project at that time in his first year. During Trump's first year in his first term, he had implemented about 65% of what was in that project and was very proud, of course, because he had done more than Reagan.
That is what it says. But did you find what that 64% actually was? Because they say a lot of things. And when you go and try and what are those 64% of things? The only thing that I find, it's all their own documents that say that.
Well, if you take it, it's a great question. If my understanding in the research that I have done, I don't know that I would be able to state that here are the 64 policies that were or 64% of policies that were checked off. But the how do I want to say this? If you can reduce the whole project down to a list of like changing culture and changing ideology, I'm surprised it's only 64%. So the idea that all media is false, the idea that what my understanding of what America stands for, um, the idea of putting children in cages and separating them from their parents would be so antithetical. And by the time that happened, it was almost kind of like, wow, you did find something else to shock me, right? Like that in the shift of where we are as a country, the fact that we are not respected as a global leader. um, I would even say that like Obama, when they called it an apology tour, when he first got into office and he had to he went around and made amends to everything that happened during the Bush years. Um, what Trump did as far as our global standing was even harder to respond to, which is part of the reason why Trump's reelection has had a global impact. I think that's built in to more than half, instead of saying 64, 65, more than half of the movement of the progressive or the conservative agenda, Freudian slip, the conservative agenda was 100% established within year one. I would say could have been more, but it was probably taken very off task and off target when COVID hit.
Sure.
But even in the COVID response or lack of response, there was not an urgency of global leadership coming from the United States. It's very counter to what would have been expected. Take care of your own family values matter. That's not how vaccines work, right? So like to have to kind of defend how science works. So then we just debunked science, deferring everything to the states down to local school boards. I think that's all kind of built in. Anyway, it's a very long answer.
No, I brought it up because it's two of the first things I highlighted were two things you've already touched on. How far back this goes. Like it feels like everybody I know has heard of Project 2025. So it was interesting to me that, oh no, this goes back. Like I did not know that, which led me to down the first, in our previous conversation, you mentioned falling into various rabbit holes. So I did as well. So this book is called Reaganland, and it's goes back to that first mandate for leadership or whatever. And the subheading is America's Right Turn and how it really started back in 1976. And you're right. I think that Carter was the first one. You know, we think everything is so now, but when you look back, like they really laid the groundwork for this even before Fox News existed. Like this groundwork goes way back.
Right. And if you think about, so Roe v. Wade was 1974. 76 would have been the next election.
Yes.
Right. So like, oh, okay, great. And that's kind of what I mean by like, this has oddly been a very unexpected source of hope for me, because it's not, I mean, I'm not going to lie. I've had some very heated conversations with my partner, and he's like, this is not progressive. This is not hope making. What is going on? But for me, at least, this is not new hatred. This is long time coming hatred.
Yes.
That is seen as a significant different way of prioritizing life, pun intended and pun not intended, so that it's not even seen as hatred. It's just seen as a wildly different set of priorities than I have. And so it has helped me realign my own sense of priorities. And it is very helpful. I was born in 1974. It is very helpful to know that this is not new, and that means that my entire lifespan has occurred while this has been happening and I just didn't know about it.
That
Okay.
agreed.
Now I know about it.
Context.
Now I know about it. So now let's go see what's happening. So I mentioned the what is the conservative agenda. So I wrote this down. Revitalizing our economy, strengthening our national security, and halting the centralization of power. In a nutshell, that is the conservative agenda. And when I think about what could get implemented and how this is going to impact 500,000 government employees, even more people who are receiving the services or are impacted by the policies. When I think about that, their justification for it is to revitalize our economy, strengthen our national security, and halt the centralization of power. By centralization of power, it makes sense to then move things out to the states, move offices around the country to kind of create a fuller net that honestly could have a benefit, because if people who are creating policies on a federal level could actually be located where those actual people are, it might lead to better policies. Like, I can intellectually understand why that would be happening.
That's the thing, right? There's a couple times when you read it and you read a sentence and you're like, actually, I don't disagree with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm trying really hard in every chapter to really point out, like, oh, I'm really excited this got included. I really like I just recorded Department of Health and Human Services, and I'm really excited that it specifies that miscarriage treatment and ectopic pregnancies should never be conflated with abortion services. That's amazing. Can I put that on a t-shirt? Right? Like, if you're in an echo chamber of like all women's health is getting ready to get canceled and that gets pulled out, that there are moments where if we can check ourselves, we can actually see some common ground. And that's also hope making. So what do you have another thing you were going to say? You look like you're going to say something.
Just that it was helpful. I haven't gotten hopeful yet, but it has been helpful, if not hopeful, to be able to put everything in context and realize, oh, how far back this went. And I guess the difference between now, like I said, everybody I know has heard of Project 2025, and nobody had heard of, even in 2016, there was the mandate for leadership, they called it. I'm not quite sure what's so different from 2024 to 2016, but certainly from 2016 to the earlier iterations, like there was no internet, like, so there wasn't any way to share it as widely, certainly, as this one had been. So I think that was something the left, the progressive side, did poorly when the 2016 election was getting this kind of word out sooner as to what all of these, that this document exists, that existed then, whether it was 922 pages in 2016, it did exist. So the context has been super, super helpful. And for as many sentences as I've said, like, oh, okay, I agree, there's other sentences that are just not true, that you want to like actively combat.
And there's no citation for it. So it feels
that's why I asked you about the 64%. I'm like, just because you're saying that's true, is that true? Yeah.
Right. Yeah, so many.
But some stuff you can prove is not true. Like of those three things that you said essentially were the conservative agenda, the first one you said is something economy, revitalize?
Revitalizing our economy.
Okay, so then we need a different word than revitalize, because historically, when you look at any economic indicator under a Republican presidency versus a Democrat presidency, the economic indicators are always better, always show growth under a Democratic president. But that's not what this says. Like,
yeah, well, inside the words revitalize the economy, what I think it's virtue signaling is an emphasis on a free market, small businesses, and small businesses are defined as 500 employees or smaller, and there's a very strong emphasis on medium-sized businesses, which doesn't exist. There's no classification. You're either a huge global giant or you are a small business. But if the economy was based on business versus the consumer, or potentially, I'm being charitable right now, consumer choice, then there's no need for federal programs. Everything can be privatized. And if it's privatized down to an individual consumer choice, someone can make money off that. So it's very pro-capitalism versus a global economy or serving as a global economy into the future. It's just, that's what that means. Or at least that's how it's filtering through after having read everything. To strengthen our national security, what I think is interesting there is that if I look at it from a duplicative bureaucracy place, I see some real strengths, right? Is that if we can get everyone using the same systems and all the information and all the data that's collected to be easily accessible by the people who need that data, I do think that that would improve national security inside the country, across states, and probably even our role around the different borders, et cetera, which is much bigger than just immigration issues. But the role of the national security includes like our military defenses, being able to use like the space net, looking at the digital divide and our access to internet and broadband, what's actually happening inside the different military branches and how they're collaborating together, how we're planning ahead, whether we're talking about national disasters or the census. All of that information, I think, is actually going to improve the security of our nation, right? If we're not worried about helping everybody else in the world, because we are clearly taking our balls and coming back home.
Yes, very isolationist, very, yes, America first, blah, blah.
Yeah, very, 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 very much so. One of the things that he mentions in the Onward closing chapter, I was curious if you had any thoughts or impressions about it, but it's people are policy.
I highlighted that phrase.
It has been a constant theme throughout all of the mandates for leadership since 1979, is that people are policy. And I think one of the inconsistent language use that is consistently showing up is the phrase nonpartisan civil servants that are loyal to the president's agenda. And that sentence does not make sense to me.
No, that is an oxymoron. You are correct. There's a jumbo
if
shrimp.
It's like if it's like a magnet and you put another magnet close to it that says the people are policy, somehow in my mind it makes the sentence makes a little bit more sense. Because it's not actually nonpartisan. It is actually putting the president's agenda down into the people and their mandates of their jobs and what they are doing if they are representing federal, state, or local government work. What are your thoughts on that? And please disagree with me if you think I made too big of a leap.
No, that's why I also highlighted having the right personnel. Well, the right personnel would be people who are qualified to run those departments, but that's clearly not their focus right now. And a lot of this hiring, or not hiring, but vetting began, months ago. The replacing people with institutional knowledge with nonpartisan hacks is not a way to run any agency, of course. So of course the people, besides all of the agencies within, like the concept of privatization you mentioned earlier, like privatize everything. Privatizing, say, the post office is, somebody will make money, everybody's service will be worse. You could do that for every agency. Yeah, somebody will make money and everybody's services will be worse. The right people.
Privatizing nuclear waste disposal.
What could go wrong?
That is keeping me awake at night.
Sure.
I'm going to go with a hard no on that.
Right, because it's the same time people are privatizing or closing or shrinking the EPA, which would in theory be watching out to make sure that those private nuclear waste dumping isn't dumping into any streams or waterways. I don't know. I'm a fan of clean water, clean air. And that's the part of so much of this that makes no sense to me, is that these people nobody will police themselves. They do have to breathe the same water and the same air, which is the part I cannot understand. Like, if you kill everybody, there'll be nobody left to buy your products. So I fail to see how we're not all on the same page. Yeah.
Right. I do think that there's something ironic about there. I'm looking for the EPA page. There's something ironic that the Stop the Coup summary of the whole project, right? They've done summaries of every chapter.
Yep.
The last sentence is Project 2025 is at war with choice, and the America is built on the very principle, the freedom to choose. And what's interesting to me is that a free market is based on choice. It's also based on truth in advertisement, and it's based on supply and demand of what the market would want. When we start talking about privatizing and businesses, it throughout all of the chapters where it mentions privatization, it very much talks about getting rid of processes in which to resolve disputes, etc. Like none of that needs to be happening. What needs to be happening is truth in advertisement, and the consumer can choose. So
but how is a monopoly in anything a real choice?
Right. That is exactly the point. High five, Stacy, is that if you are making a choice out of one person's agenda, that isn't a choice. And then probably my most the vibe that is making me the most infuriated is that it is so anti-communism, anti-China that it doesn't understand what communism and socialism, what is an actual oligarch, what is actually a dictatorship. All of those are reducing choice. So don't tell me that you're talking about free market and you're providing choices because of the free market as you are eradicating options and choices for individual freedom, individual autonomy. If you are leaving it up to the states, you're then deregulating the states that agree with you and overly regulating the states that don't agree with you. That's not what those words mean. So that doesn't work.
And which leads me to my second book that I picked up. And
Perfect.
The Capital Order, How Economists Invented Austerity and Paved the Way to Fascism. I have not read this one yet either. I just picked it up this morning from the other room. These are all books in my house, but that I have not yet gotten to read, that I didn't know I was being prepared for by participating in this project. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. You volunteered, you silly goof.
But the other thing you said that startled me the most, and I don't even know, spoiler, maybe it was in some of the other chapters I picked from, the focus on China. I was not expecting that.
Oh my gosh, it is a constant baseline.
Yeah.
And only China, which is so interesting to me.
Agreed. Agreed.
So what is fascinating to me about this is, so I served in the Peace Corps in Bulgaria, and I was there during their official fall of communism. And the official fall of communism was followed by a very fake, very rigged, very obviously performative Democratic presidential election, which was then toppled and overturned by the people to have an actual Democratic election and presidency. So it was a fascinating time for me to be there as like this naive young 20 something who had studied politics and economics and history with like great interest. I was actually a ceramics major, but I was interested. And to be in a place where I was protected by all of my American rights and values, I was actually earning a salary that I was secretly getting while my fellow teachers hadn't been paid in months. And if something dangerous happened, a Ford Explorer would come and swoop me away at any time. So it is safe to say that I was having a different experience than your average person experiencing what was happening in Bulgaria between 96 and 98. However, when I think about, like, for example, hair dye, I am a big fan of hair dye. And what is interesting to me is that my fellow teachers, students, their parents, etc., they would talk about the month's hair dye, because hair dye would come largely from the Soviet Union, and everyone in the country would have access to the same inventory, and that was that month's option.
Oh.
So you had the choice.
Blue came in. We're blue.
Yeah, or red number 8, right? So you had a choice of whether you wanted to dye your hair or not, but it was only that color. So at the end of the month, you sent it back. You sent all the inventory that didn't get sold, you got sent back. And based on how many boxes you sent back, you were sent the next month's color, only what you sold. So that actually killed businesses. It wasn't a choice in project. Because eventually, if you didn't sell anything because they didn't like that color, then you didn't get any hair dye the next
Hmm.
month. Then how are you going to stay in
Yeah,
business? Which is part of the reason, fun facts for Eastern European travelers, that you can go to like a little corner store and it might sell bras, tires, and bananas. But it's because they had to mix up their inventory to be able to stay open because their choice of inventory was taken away.
that is
So
interesting.
if you're talking about being anti-communist, that's one thing. What they're actually talking about, I think, their loathing of China is that China has played Russia and the United States in a way that has benefited it to be both labeled globally as a developing country and also have one of the most successful economies on the
Yeah.
globe at the same time. And so the reason why we are targeting China, or this Heritage Foundation is targeting China, is because it very easily could supersede the United States as a global economic force any minute. It is not because of communism, because
Oh,
removing choice is actually far closer to a dictatorship.
right. And they're a
I will
hyper-capitalistic
step off my
society.
soapbox now.
No, hyper-capitalism like here. And by the way, I don't know the answer, but I could find out just how many acres of American farmland have we sold to various Chinese entities?
I would assume hundreds of thousands, not to
Like,
mention um, their owned solar and wind farms.
right. Yep. Like, at what point did that seem like a good idea?
Private business. Then we could also talk about real estate. How much real estate in the United States is owned, largely not even occupied, by people who don't even live in the United States?
Yes, or is occupied, like both of my children are in their early 20s trying to pay rent. Rents are not the same as when I was in my early 20s. And they're not even owned by people. Like they're all owned by like conglomerates. You know what I'm saying?
Venture capitalists.
Yeah. That's why I started.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure if that was right, but it's just not the same as when you, as an individual, might purchase an investment property. Like all of the properties have been snatched up, which is why housing is just untenable nationwide. I live in New Jersey, so like close to New York City, of course, rents are high. Yeah, except no, it's the same everywhere. My daughter is in Florida. Her rent is even more than my son's. Like there is no reason for that other than just unchecked greed. The whole Gilded Age thing, I can't believe we're doing this again. And the fact that they're happy about it, like, oh, look, a new Gilded Age. Hello. The 1920s were followed by the 1930s. Was that any fun? How about the 40s? Was that fun? Are we doing that again too? Because
It was
that
fun
is
for some.
clearly the path we are on.
Well, and by mentioning greed, I think that ultimately Karl Marx would agree. I am using language from Project 2025. I am a self identified extremist, leftist, Marxist agenda holding person. And the reason why, one of many reasons, but one of the main reasons Marxism didn't work is greed, the lack of empathy for other people.
That, and wasn't it Fauci who was like, I don't know how to explain to you that you should care about other people. Like, I don't know if you flat out don't have that empathy for other people. I don't know how to fix that. I
don't
say
know
a
how to
lot
fix it
jokingly,
either.
like can't fix stupid, but it's more like you can educate people, but you cannot instill a sense of empathy where one just does not exist.
Yeah, in some of my webinars, I start off with the very first slide. The first exercise is in my online programs. Is what is your individual definition of responsibility, and what is your individual definition of agency, which is what you do with what you feel responsible for. And if I'm about to engage in a conversation and I can understand what they feel responsible for and what they feel like they're supposed to do with that sense of responsibility, I can have a conversation about almost anything. What we're doing is we're assuming the people we're talking to have the same definition as you. So when I talk to somebody who they feel responsible for their immediate nuclear family and that is it, it doesn't matter what I say because I feel responsible for people I will never even meet.
Agreed. Right.
The degree of responsibility a parent feels for their kid is what I feel for generations in the past and generations moving forward. So we can talk about the depth of responsibility on the same page. But when we start talking about agency, agency is over the one person they feel responsible for, maybe the 4 people they feel responsible for. But my agency is broader, and I can get overwhelmed and I can get exhausted by that. And then we can also meet at exhaustion and overwhelmed, but the scales are different. My therapist always tells me that when people talk about like there's just too much on my plate is very large and there is still too much on it. And I know people who have a very, very small plate, but there's too much on it. So then the place where we can meet is at too much. And then how do we sort through what we're doing, or how do we increase a plate size? How do we take care of ourselves when we're at too much? We can have those conversations once we know that we're dealing with different flatware. Anyway,
it is
onward.
Yeah, but I didn't bring this book because I didn't know the conversation would go there. But when you were saying how we have different definitions, not so much, I think you and I probably have similar definitions, but that's what's been interesting about the cult vibe about so much of it, and like the flags and the rallies and whatever. Where I live, my next door neighbors and a lot of my neighbors have those flags, which I find helpful to know, like, okay, you don't want to be my friend. Thank you for letting me know. Like, thank you for that outward sign of that. So a book that I didn't bring over was actually about the Rwanda massacre. Remember, some years ago, there was a big Rwanda thing. But what kicked off that initial violence of like neighbor against neighbor was talk radio. And it was simply that they had broken into like their, I'll say tribes for lack of a better word, but they're separate cohorts. And it was talk radio that was like, okay, now you need to just go and kill your neighbors that are not part of us, or not one of us. And that was enough for them to just devolve into like just huge, like neighbor on neighbor killing. That's the part that is so scary. And that is, to me, is knowing that my neighbors that have such a definition of family or empathy or responsibility could be turned that quick, because I absolutely think they could. And the amount of guns that this country is awash in is terrifying to me. That level of violence absolutely could come here. People that think that, oh, that or anything couldn't happen here need to look at pictures of women walking around Tehran in the early 70s dressed in completely normal Western clothing, or in Kabul before Afghanistan, again, in the like 60s and 70s, when that was, like the Riviera of the, well, I'll mess that up, but it was like a vacation destination. It was super cosmopolitan. Like, what is curious to me is how anybody thinks that kind of repression could work here in our both. It's such a big country geographically, and so many people, where some of these other countries are much geographically smaller and easier to control. Although not China. China is both geographically large and lots of people.
Yeah,
and
but
very
it's doing a
repressive.
great job of controlling it, right?
Exactly. Very repressive. So that's very terrifying to me.
Yeah, I think that the propaganda and how easy it is to be persuaded is something that we need to be mindful of. And also it is another place of empathy, right? Is that I'm speaking specifically to pinko commie liberals. We should not be voting people off of the island because they got persuaded by very persuaded propaganda that did its job. I was having a debate with someone that we were talking about the tolerance paradox. I'm not saying to tolerate hatred. I'm saying that you can still love or have empathy, at least, for someone on a human level who has been inundated with information that answered their legitimate fears, and so they glommed onto it.
And that's true for low information voters. But how about people that really should know better?
What people shouldn't know better? Like, as a DEI person, I've been telling people forever, just because you are one doesn't mean you get it. And you could be a this, but you are a this, and you're only focusing on the this part and not the this part. It the irony is not lost on me, and we coulda, shoulda, woulda done a lot of different things, but this is where we're at, right? So one of the pieces I really want to make sure that we kind of end on is the now what, right? And so I said this at the beginning, but I think for a lot of people, we need to understand, first off, let me start over. there are people who I believe are genuinely disappointed by the election results. And my first thought to you is that if you're disappointed, then you weren't paying attention, right? Like, because this shouldn't have been a surprise.
I was surprised.
Well, this is good. So now let's.
I really thought we had this, and yeah.
I wanted to have it, deeply wanted to have it, and I would love to be wrong. Oh my God, I've never wanted to be more wrong in my entire life. But if the progressive viewpoint can't understand how this was too institutional, too all of the different identities that we don't even want to talk about. Like another baseline in Project 2025 is that any racist or any race-based agenda based on equity is racist. Right.
Yep.
Because it's pointing out race. That is not what those words mean. But if that is something, that's something we need to be paying attention to that, right? And a biracial woman married to a Jewish man, the United States was not ready for that. And that shouldn't be surprising. When we actually look at what happened in the election, 60% of eligible voters voted. We had 40% of eligible voters didn't even vote. And of the 60% that did vote, more than half of the people who did vote voted for someone else. Trump is the first Republican to win popular vote in a very, 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 very long time. And so then I counter this with, for example, instead of talking about student loan forgiveness, which is, I am stunned that that is a controversial topic, but it is also only relevant to a certain sector of the U.S. population.
Maybe 30%.
If you really wanted to do something, what about medical debt? Medical debt could have hit a lot of people, right? When we start talking about unions, labor equity, labor rights, things like that, super pro-union, sounds amazing. And when you are dealing with the vast majority of the country don't have union representation, or they are not active in their unions, coming at it from unions is a targeted audience that wasn't broad enough, right? I think that there's a lot to be learned, and I think one of the biggest lessons that we liberal, Democrat, progressive types is we, at minimum, have just learned that we are an organized minority. And a lot of us are not comfortable being a minority, but welcome. This is what it feels like. And if we lose our ability to stay organized, like I'm seeing people, their New Year's resolution is to not watch the news. I am fine with you not watching the news, but you need to be getting your news from someplace. You still have to do your due diligence. You need to check your sources. You need to check where your news is coming from. You need to stay informed intentionally and recognize any bias that might be happening from where you are getting your news. How can we stay organized so that we can continue to do work towards the progressive agenda? Because if we have anything to learn from the Heritage Foundation, is this is how you've been organized since 1979.
You keep saying we need to stay organized, but I think we need to get organized. I think we were not organized. I think that Obama got elected and we were like, we're good now. Like, and that was that. I haven't, I really feel like we're starting before.
Some would argue that that happened with Clinton. Right? Like, people don't remember this, but when Obama first got elected and was being called the first Black president, which I always find fascinating. Biracial president, but he ain't white, so we're just going to call him Black. It was corrected because Clinton was seen as an honorary Black person.
I remember the whole saxophone on Arsenio Hall thing. Remember all that?
Because he played a saxophone. Wow. Okay, great. Like, when you start replaying these things, you're like, well, no wonder this is how we got here.
Oh, absolutely. That's, again, back to our conversation earlier. The context is super useful.
Right. Of 2 terms of Clinton's presidency, Most people our age absolutely remember saxophone on Arsenio Hall. Out of 8 years, that's what we remember. Now, we might remember other things, but as the rise of media, even when we're talking about Nixon and Kennedy, that was color television. When we start talking about the performance of leadership, we lost leadership. And
yes,
it is up to us. It's up to us to get that back. And to me, I love that it's called Onward, because I don't think we're at afterward yet. I think they got plans, and if they got plans, we need to have plans.
We do, but I don't see anything comparable to this.
Not yet. But I mean, heaven forbid we actually start learning from them. We could do that. We could start getting more involved on a local level. Go to your school board meetings, go to your local city council meetings, get involved. I know personally, I am much more informed about federal elections than I am statewide elections. Getting involved on those kind of levels is really important because they are banking on us not being.
Agreed. And I have several friends who are now school board members solely to be able to push back. Right.
I think, did you have another book recommendation? I want to make sure you got
I have several. I want to point out an older Heather Cox Richardson book, How the South Won the Civil War, because again, it goes back before that, but when we gave up on, Reconstruction right after, there's a lot of lessons to be learned from that time period.
Heather Cox Richardson also has a great daily email that I would highly recommend that is about like today in history. It's fantastic. And just a little shout out to history. Indian law and Jim Crow laws were the basis of Mein Kampf. When we compared the bad guys to Hitler, we taught Hitler how to
100%. I tell people that all the time. Yes.
If we don't take responsibility for our own failed attempts at genocide, all we're doing is teaching other people that it worked.
Correct. And that's what's been so alarming about the rise of the far right in Germany, is because they teach their history in way better ways than we do. And it's happening again.
Yeah.
But we don't teach ours at all.
A friend of mine, actually, this is pre-election. We were, it was over breakfast, and he's all perky and not as informed as I am in politics or whatever, well-intentioned. And he's like, what's going to be great after the election is MAGA's just going to disappear. And I was like, what? And he's like, yeah. I mean, like white supremacy and everything, that all just disappeared after the war. And I was like, that is factually false.
Yep.
And until we realize it didn't disappear, it became, I'm Southern, it became back porch behavior. And then it got permission to become in the house behavior. And then it got permission to become front porch behavior. And now we are leading it.
Lead it. That's it. Now forget saying the quiet parts out loud. Like that's the basis of everything again now. That has been also beyond disturbing.
Yeah.
Like I did not know. All right. I did not know.
Professor Stacy, any more book recommendations that you have?
Just the final Heather Cox Richardson one, Democracy Awakening. This is the most recent one. Yes, I recommend, of course, everything she says, of course, the daily newsletter. And you talked about where you're getting your news from, all of the stuff, many of the Substacks, and just eliminating the corporate news as much as possible and getting the news directly from informed individuals. I'm finding I've had to turn off the news notifications on my phone and go and purposefully read the stuff when I am ready to.
I deeply, deeply appreciate you and everyone else that volunteered to have these random conversations with me so that I could think about the Stroganoff brain that occurred after reading through the document. But the least I wanted to do was to demystify what I was seeing in the liberal news and what I was seeing in conservative news about Project 2025, because I knew there had to be more. And boy, is there.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. So now hopefully each chapter is a little bit more accessible. As we went along, I talked about unanswerable questions that you need to be having conversations with your friends and your family over dinner, deciding what does truth mean. I think we are really, really, really far away from a collective answer of what the truth is, what are facts. what is getting checked, what's the difference between performing media and doing journalism, and how is the truth being reported and how is it being recorded. And if we can at least start with some of these fundamental dinner table conversations that I hope are helpful, I think we might see our way through this. I last thing I'll say, and then I'll give you, Stacy, the last word. But it is important to remember not everyone survived the first Trump presidency, and I am likely, because of my own privilege, I own a home, the amount of money that I make, the amount of education, I am likely to be less scathed than some, if scathed at all, over the next, I'm assuming the presidency is going to be 4 years long, but that is not the case for everyone. So what can I do with what I do have to actually get these conversations going, keep us together, stay organized, and onward ourselves?
Thank
Stacy,
you.
last
That
word.
is, no, I appreciate your last word. I just want to say thank you for pulling everybody together. I think this was an inspired project. I know that I'm sorry, it's loud in the background. Sorry
Okay, hear it.
But thank you. I know I was struggling with what to do next and how to respond. So I appreciate this opportunity and to force me to read it because I was just avoiding it. So I appreciate the nudge to actually get involved and really kind of deconstruct what's in here, a lot of which doesn't make sense, but a lot of which does. And either way, we should know what it is. So thank you, Jess. I appreciate you and all of the effort you have put into this, bringing so many people together.
Oh, thank you so much. And everyone together, no matter what. That's the most important thing, together.